Historically and artistically, it's of the greatest importance.
In 1915, The Birth of a Nation invented the cinema as we know it.
Yet its message is vile and racist.
But it led to America's bloodiest racial confrontation since the Civil War.
That film was responsible for who knows how many Negroes being lynched, castrated, or beat.
If there was ever a movie that denigrated America and its citizens, it's that movie.
It was the gigantic hit. The financial success really changed the nature of movies.
It even earned a presidential seal of approval.
The famous line from Woodrow Wilson is that this is history written with lightning.
It established and codified a language that influenced all films that followed in every country on earth.
It is great. Great does not mean good. It does not mean morally good.
Why do we still consider this the greatest masterpiece of cinema? I mean, there's something almost sadistic about it.
Was D.W. Griffith's 1915 epic the most important film in history, or a vicious hate crime? The Birth of a Nation, up next on Movies That Shook the World. Hollywood spends $10 billion a year making movies. Some hit, some miss, some shake the world. March 3rd, 1915. The Birth of a Nation exploded across movie screens as the biggest, longest, most ambitious movie of all time, and easily the most controversial.
It was like an atomic bomb on the scene. The line was around the block to get in.
People dressed up, and they had ushers for the first time, showing people their seats in white gloves. It was a massive social event.
He recruited several dozen horsemen to ride on white horses with white sheets up and down the major avenues of New York City.
But riots erupted nationwide as furious African-American critics blasted the film's blatant racism.
Never since has there been a response quite as articulate, quite as forceful, and as focused as the resistance to Birth of a Nation.
America in 1915 was still a bitterly divided country.
At the time the film was made, the Civil War was closer than World War II is now. There were people with absolutely fresh memories.
There were already so many lynchings going on because they looked at a white woman. Or maybe a black man said something that stood up for himself, and he ended up swinging from a tree.
Angry Southern whites argued that the North's occupation of the South during Reconstruction and the granting of power to former slaves had been a vicious crime against their defeated homeland.
Reconstruction to them was kind of carried out as a rape fantasy.
One incensed Southerner was the openly racist novelist Thomas Dixon.
Thomas Dixon wrote a book called The Klansman.
So that novel is really about how, the South must rise again. These carpetbaggers from the North, things were good the way they were.
It treated as its hero the Ku Klux Klan. That was the point of view.
Dixon's point of view was shared by Hollywood's top director in 1915, D.W. Griffith. He explained years later in an interview.
Is it generally known that you're a Southerner?
Yes, my father was a colonel in the Confederacy. I used to get under the table and listen to my father and his friends talk about the battles they'd been through and their struggles. Those things impressed you deeply.
He came from a family that had slaves. His father was a rebel.
When you've heard your father tell about fighting day after day, night after night, and having nothing to eat but parched corn, and about your mother staying up night after night sewing robes for the Klan. The Klan at that time was needed and served a purpose.
Griffith had become, before he made Birth of a Nation, probably the leading American filmmaker.
In hundreds of short one-reel films, Griffith had perfected radical new techniques that we take for granted today, like the close-up and night photography. But his grand ambitions were frustrated by the primitive state of filmmaking in 1915.
That the idea of the feature film had not yet been established. People were still mostly attached and familiar with one-reelers.
He's looking for something that is going to demonstrate his ability to direct a huge epic film.
Jealous of the longer films trickling in from Europe, Griffith dreamed of creating the first great American epic.
So when Thomas Dixon approached him with Birth of a Nation, he saw an opportunity to make an epic film.
Dixon's twisted tale followed a white Southern family ruined by the Civil War. Their Reconstruction-era struggle against Northern occupiers and freed slaves struck a chord with the director.
It's about a tremendous struggle. It's about a story of people that were fighting desperately against great odds, great sacrifices, suffering, death. It's a great struggle, a great story.
As one of America's top directors, Griffith pieced together the financing and signed up his favorite actress, Lillian Gish, launching her to stardom.
Cost $100,000 to make, but it would be like a $100 million movie if no one had ever made a $100 million movie.
Part of his significance was just the scale of it, you know, the scale of the action.
And he had thousands and thousands of actors portraying soldiers, recreating Civil War battles. No one had tried to do anything like that before. How do you shoot these battle scenes? Griffith was the first one to really do it.
Griffith astonished audiences by packing the film with his revolutionary techniques. They have formed the backbone of filmmaking ever since.
You had parallel editing, you had wonderful intertitles, you had unusual lighting patterns.
Fading in and out, creating vignettes, split screen.
Shooting the action from several different viewpoints. Shooting at night with magnesium flares. I mean, what audacity.
The parallel cutting, the close-up. The world never seen a film like that.
It established and codified a language that influenced all films that followed in every country on earth.
But Griffith also packed the film with scenes of racism that horrified blacks then and disgust viewers today.
All of the kind of leading black characters are white people, really, in blackface, as if you don't notice.
They are so bizarrely uncharacteristic of any human beings to the extent that some people call them surrealistic.
He certainly could have found outstanding black actors to work with him. He chose not to.
It's a scene where the white woman jumps off the cliff. She commits suicide rather than being touched by a black savage who supposedly is going to rape her.
The scene in the legislature of this southern capital where you have black legislators with their shoes off, drinking alcohol, behaving cartoonishly, behaving like animals.
But perhaps most shocking is the film's glorification of the Ku Klux Klan as saviors of white Southerners after the Civil War.
The heroes in this case were the Ku Klux Klan, and suggest that these people who were ultimately terrorists were basically freedom fighters.
Knowing that a stage play based on Dixon's book had sparked black protests a few years earlier, Griffith made a savvy move to place his film beyond criticism.
Griffith was able to arrange a White House showing for President Woodrow Wilson. It was the first film ever shown in the White House. And Wilson loved it, and he endorsed it.
The famous line from Woodrow Wilson is that this is history written with lightning.
I mean, that's putting the stamp of approval from the highest authority in the land. So, I mean, like, lynching is in season, year-round.
With the blessing of the president, the opening in New York was the cultural event of the decade.
Griffith did insist not just on an organ or a piano accompanying the movie, but on a fairly glorious musical score played by a full orchestra.
As part of the opening festivities, white-robed Klansmen paraded through Manhattan.
The people who would have been offended by it either, didn't have a voice at all, or their voice was somewhat muted because they were in such the minority.
White audiences reveled in the unprecedented spectacle, even as Black America recoiled in shock.
I think moviegoers were so kind of enraptured by the skill. They were just carried away by the sheer bustle of the action and the pace of the drama.
They had never seen anything like this in a motion picture screen before.
And suddenly, instead of people talking about novels or theater, they were talking about movies. A movie became the talked about event of the country.
After Birth of a Nation, the whole vision of what movies could do changed forever.
It made moviegoing respectable. It made it a middle-class thing to do.
The film reportedly grossed $60 million, which would be close to $1 billion today.
The visible, palpable financial success really changed the nature of movies. The era of the 1 and 2 reel film is gone. It's over.
Distributors raced to create massive new theaters suited to the coming flood of feature films.
This begins the building of the picture palaces. So you get the big, elaborate picture palaces that are going to be full services.
White audiences were dazzled by Griffith's vision, but not Black Americans. Although they were banned from many theaters, civil rights leaders alerted them to the film's hateful agenda, and they exploded in outrage.
The NAACP opposed it city by city, formulated protests, marches, demonstrations in front of theaters. People went to jail.
Coming up, The Birth of a Nation rips open racial wounds that had festered since the Civil War.
Whites went into black neighborhoods and tried to kill or maim as many people as they could.
Riots, revenge, the rise of the NAACP, and the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan when Movies That Shook the World returns.
Because of eHarmony.
On opening day in 1915, white America proclaimed The Birth of a Nation the greatest movie ever made. But outraged blacks feverishly organized to bring it down.
The film was viewed as a almost lethally dangerous vision because it gave whites the excuse to blame everything on black people. Black people viewed the film as incredibly dangerous.
Outrage over the film brought a tiny, obscure new group called the NAACP into national prominence.
For a lot of the communities where the film played, that was their first experience of the NAACP in action.
They actually did get Griffith to make some changes in some versions of it.
Part of the film, of course, that is cut out was his solution to the racial friction, which is shipping blacks back to Africa.
Despite the NAACP's success in cutting some of the most offensive scenes, the fire had been lit. Black America took to the streets.
There were actual riots in Boston and Philadelphia.
As violence spread, the NAACP switched tactics and fought to have the film banned outright as an incitement to violence.
They really had some remarkable success in northern cities, for example, where the mayor of Chicago said the film should not be shown.
Ultimately, The Birth of a Nation was banned in 8 states.
Which I think is a great thing, but again, when you repress something and you censor it, it tends to come back in all sorts of other ways.
One of those ways would poison the nation for decades. The film sparked the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, a long-disbanded hate group from the 1870s.
When Reconstruction ends in 1876, the Klan tends to disappear.
Birth of a Nation, though, basically said to the Klan, there's no need to be in hiding, come on out in the open.
On Stone Mountain in Georgia, they lit up a cross to coincide with the premiere of this film in Atlanta. And that was kind of the Klan's announcement that we're back.
It practically recreated the KKK. So talk about a film being influential.
Within a few years, the resurgent Klan was a massive force in American life.
By 1925, the Knights of the Invisible Empire were openly marching in the nation's capital.
They elected governors, senators, congressmen, both North and South. In fact, I think there were more of them in the North and the West than there were in the South.
In an era of massive black immigration to the North and other changes, the effects were lethal.
Lynchings were at an all-time high.
Whites went into black neighborhoods and tried to kill or maim as many people as they could.
You had a lot of race riots. 1919 in Chicago, you had race riots in places like Tulsa.
The film really opens up the kind of racial tensions that many had tried to put aside.
Amid the swirling clouds of hate, however, was a silver lining. Largely thanks to the controversy, the NAACP grew into the nation's premier civil rights group.
Birth of a Nation gave the NAACP a cause, a very public national cause.
It helped create that organization. It helped give it a backbone and a strength that made the NAACP a very strong organization going into the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s.
Griffith himself was stung by the criticism that he had twisted history by glorifying a hate group.
You feel as though it were true? Yes, I think it's true. Heard as Pontius Pilate said, truth? What is the truth?
I think he felt, for some reason, that he wasn't racist, you know. This is the way it was, and we're just presenting history.
He goes out the next year and makes a film called Intolerance, which is his effort to show white America and black America that he's really a liberal at heart who wants toleration for everyone.
It's a massive movie, and it was a big flop. It put him under.
D.W. Griffith sank into alcoholism and didn't make a film for the last 16 years of his life.
And he died a drunk bum. Too bad he couldn't have, been a drunk bum before Birth of a Nation came along.
Griffith was dead, but thanks largely to his film, a new kind of cinema was born.
A number of African Americans were so distraught by these negative images that they went out and started making their own films. It gave rise to the birth of what became known as race films.
African-American film, in a lot of ways, grew out of the fact that Birth of a Nation was so overtly racist, and individuals felt the need to answer that and respond.
Coming up, the bitterness sparked by the Birth of a Nation rages for decades.
People who threatened my life, threatened my family, threatened to burn down the theater.
90 years of controversy and no end in sight when Movies That Shook the World returns. For a quarter century after its premiere, The Birth of a Nation reigned as the highest-grossing film of all time. But the bitterness it sparked would haunt America for decades.
It remained the most successful box office attraction in American movie history until Gone with the Wind, which, takes up a lot of the same themes.
A love affair filled with all the fire and fury of the times in which it happened.
Gone with the Wind has remarkable similarities to Birth of a Nation. But when David O. Selznick began producing the film version, he was determined not to reopen the wounds inflicted by D.W. Griffith.
His instructions to one of the directors of Gone with the Wind were quite explicit. I don't want to do a pro-Klan film. I don't want to be known for that.
If you compare it to Birth of a Nation, it's not as racist. Selznick at least had black actors in the film. Hattie McDaniel, of course, won the Academy Award, but I think that's still a very problematic film also.
As Gone with the Wind's star rose, Birth of a Nation's declined. But the debate it sparked over the social responsibility of cinema has consumed the film industry for decades.
This is a sort of fundamental question that people have asked about art, I think, for a long time, and I think Birth of a Nation really symbolizes that split.
Since 1949, the highest award given by the prestigious Directors Guild of America was named for D.W. Griffith. But bowing to relentless protests in the 90s, his name was finally stripped away.
It had been the D.W. Griffith Award for Lifetime Achievement. They just changed it to the Directors Guild Award.
Yeah, I objected to using his name. What if you do have an African-American filmmaker that wins its award? It's like, I mean, what do you say?
The controversy still rages in film schools today, 90 years after Griffith released his epic.
I know film students that rebelled against the curriculum because they were sick of it. And after a few film classes, you're like, I'm not watching Birth of a Nation anymore. I'm sorry, I'm not going to watch it anymore.
Birth of a Nation should be taught in film schools, and it is taught in film schools. It just needs to be put in the proper context.
I think that when you do show the film, let's talk about the effects of the movie, not just the close-up was developed in this film. Let's talk about how this film was used as a recruiting tool for the Ku Klux Klan.
The fury is hardly confined to film studies. In the summer of 2004, a Los Angeles theater planned a rare public screening of Birth of a Nation. Some members of the public struck back.
People who threatened my life, threatened my family, threatened to burn down the theater, threatened to harm people who came to the theater. I canceled the picture. And all hell broke loose then on the censorship issue.
The Birth of a Nation remains a testament to the beauty and sinister power of artistic expression. Griffith's work precipitated an ideology of hate that spanned 50 years and launched a counter-movement that is still fighting today.
The film is hugely important today because it is impossible to understand some of the passions that animated politics in the American South without seeing this movie.
I also think it's important that as a nation we don't overlook our history and pretend that everything was always fine or that we weren't capable of such horrible misrepresentation.
It may be the ultimate in terms of technological advancement. But how do you continue to celebrate Birth of a Nation, which has promoted such evil and hatred? How long do we have to endure that?